She owned nothing. She was worth nothing. The woman shuffling through the psychiatric ward in Oxford wore tattered clothing scavenged from hospital bins. Her face, once proclaimed the most beautiful in Europe, was grotesquely deformed by paraffin wax injections that had hardened and migrated beneath her skin. She muttered to portraits that existed only in her fractured memory. The nurses didn't know this forgotten mad woman had once been the Duchess of Marlborough, mistress of Blenheim Palace, heir to millions. They didn't know she had destroyed one of the greatest marriages in Gilded Age history to become what she was now. Insane, deformed, alone. February 7th, 1881. Paris, France. Gladys Marie Deacon was born into American wealth that promised everything. Her father's Boston banking fortune, $8 million. Like a $250 million in today's money. Enough to maintain palaces on 2 continents. Enough to ensure lifelong security forever. Instead, that fortune would be consumed by scandal, obsession, and a marriage to a duke who would take everything, give nothing but a worthless title, and leave her to die in a mental institution 96 years later. This is the story of Gladys Deacon, whose life reveals how obsession destroys more efficiently than poverty ever could, how pride costs more than any fortune can afford, how becoming a duchess can be the worst thing that ever happens to a woman. This is not a story about bad luck. This is a story about a woman who spent 60 years appraising a man who wasn't worth pursuing, a woman who destroyed a duchess to become a duchess, a woman who possessed staggering beauty, she had formidable intelligence and enough money to live like royalty, but who died with brain damage, facial deformities, and not a penny to her name. From the Paris of her birth to the Oxford asylum of her death, Gladys's story is about what happens when brilliant women waste their lives on worthless men. But to understand how Gladys lost everything, we must begin where the money came from, and we must begin with murder. Edward Parker Deacon made his fortune the way most Gilded Age millionaires did, through other people's money. Born in 1844 in Boston to an old New England family of moderate means, he entered banking at 21, working first as a clerk at a small Boston institution before recognizing that real wealth lay not in America, but in Europe, where American capital was desperately needed and American bankers were treated as nobility. By 1870, he had established himself in Paris, creating investment partnerships that funneled American money into European railways, mining operations, and government bonds. His genius was simple. He took a percentage of everything. 5% of 10 million is 500,000. Do that twice a year, every year, for 15 years, and you have $8 million. He worked 70-hour weeks. He trusted no one. He married strategically. Florence Baldwin was not his equal. Born in 1858 to a Newport family of faded distinction but persistent social ambition, she brought beauty, impeccable manners, and desperation to the marriage in 1879. She was 21, he was 35, and the settlement was brutal in its clarity. He would provide everything: Parisian mansion, Newport summer cottage, servants numbering 42, unlimited clothing allowance, jewelry to the value of $200,000 within the first 5 years of marriage. She would provide heirs, specifically sons, and absolute discretion. She would not embarrass him. She would not question him. She would not spend beyond her allowance without his written permission. She signed. She had no choice. Women of her class and era had no choice. They had 4 children. Gladys was the third, born in the Paris mansion at 78 Rue de la Faisanderie in the 16th arrondissement. The house was 18th century, purchased for $350,000 and immediately renovated for another $200,000. 40 rooms. Ballroom accommodating 200 guests. Gardens designed by the landscape architect who had worked at Versailles. Staff of 28. Butler, housekeeper, lady's maid for Mrs. Deacon, 3 additional maids, cook, sous chef, pastry chef, 5 footmen, coachman, 2 grooms, 3 gardeners, laundress, seamstress, children's nurse, governess, tutor. Total annual wage bill, $32,000. Edward Deacon could afford it. At the peak of his career, his annual income exceeded $600,000. He spent freely because he earned relentlessly. Into this world of suffocating wealth and rigid propriety, Gladys arrived. The nursery occupied the entire 4th floor. French windows overlooked the Bois de Boulogne. The wallpaper, hand-painted silk featuring shepherdesses and lambs, cost $4,000. Her cradle was Louis XVI, purchased at auction for $1,800. Her layette, ordered from the finest Parisian dressmaker, consisted of 140 pieces and cost $3,000. For a baby who would grow out of everything in 6 months. She was, by all accounts, an extraordinarily beautiful child. Paintings from her 3rd birthday show enormous violet blue eyes, golden curls, perfect features that suggested classical Greek sculpture. Her mother, increasingly bitter in a loveless marriage, focused obsessively on Gladys's appearance, spending fortunes on clothing, hairdressers, photographers. By age 5, Gladys had been photographed by Nadar, the most famous portrait photographer in Paris, at a sitting that cost $200. The resulting images were distributed among society families. The child was being marketed. Her education was standard for her class. Governesses, all French, taught her perfect French, decent English, some German. Piano lessons from age 4, with a teacher paid 100 francs per week. Drawing lessons from age 6. Dancing lessons from age 7. Religious instruction from a Catholic priest, despite the family being nominally Protestant, because Catholic France demanded it for social acceptance. By age 10, Gladys spoke 3 languages fluently, played piano competently, drew adequately, danced beautifully, and knew absolutely nothing about money, work, or the world outside her insulated existence. Then, on February 17th, 1892, when Gladys was 11 years old, her father murdered a man. The victim was Émile Abeille, a French aristocrat and notorious seducer, and the location was the Grand Hotel in Cannes. The method was a revolver, fired 4 times at close range. The motive was adultery. Florence Deacon had been conducting an affair with Abeille for 3 years. Edward Deacon had known for at least 18 months, but had maintained silence, calculating that a confrontation would cost him socially and financially. Then Abeille made the mistake of flaunting the affair at the Grand Hotel during the winter season, appearing publicly with Florence, staying in adjoining rooms, making no attempt at discretion. Edward Deacon, informed by hotel staff who knew him as a regular patron, travelled from Paris to Cannes, walked into Abeille's hotel room, and shot him dead while Florence watched. The scandal was unprecedented. American banker murders French nobleman over faithless wife, and the trial lasted 4 months. Edward Deacon was defended by the most expensive lawyers in France, costing him $150,000. He was found guilty, but sentenced to only 1 year in prison, reduced to 6 months on appeal, because French juries in the 1890s were sympathetic to cuckolded husbands who defended their honour. Florence Deacon was destroyed socially and legally declared an unfit mother. The children were removed from her custody. Gladys, 11 years old, watched her family explode. Her mother was sent to an asylum, judged mentally unstable. Her father, upon release from prison, took the children to America, installing them with relatives in Boston and Newport, while he returned to Paris to salvage his banking business. The fortune was damaged but not destroyed. The legal costs, Florence's medical care, the mandatory settlements to Abeille's family, the lost business during the scandal, total cost approximately $2 million. Edward Deacon was still worth $6 million. Gladys was still an heiress, but she was an heiress with a past. The murder was international news. Newspapers printed every detail. The children's names were published. Gladys's beauty was mentioned repeatedly. One reporter called her the most exquisite child ever to be scarred by such scandal. At 11, she learned that beauty made you famous and scandal made you notorious. She learned that her mother was weak and her father was violent. She learned that money couldn't prevent disaster. And she learned, though she couldn't articulate it yet, that being a woman meant being trapped. From 1892 to 1896, Gladys lived in Newport with her maternal grandmother. The house was respectable, but not grand. 15 rooms, staff of 6, carefully managed economy. Her father sent money, $5,000 per year for her maintenance, paid quarterly through a Boston lawyer who ensured she received proper clothing, education, medical care, nothing frivolous. He visited twice in 4 years. He was rebuilding his fortune and his reputation in Europe. His daughter was a reminder of his public humiliation. At 15, Gladys was sent to a French convent school, Château de Fontainebleau, 40 miles from Paris. Tuition was $3,000 per year. The school was elegant imprisonment, high walls, strict rules, girls from wealthy families learning to be marriageable. Gladys hated it and excelled at it. She was the most beautiful girl in the school. She was also the most intelligent. Teachers reported that she read philosophy, studied art history obsessively, learned Italian and Latin, and expressed opinions on politics that were shockingly informed for a teenage girl. She was too intelligent for her own good. Intelligence in women of her class was decorative, not functional. Too much intelligence made men uncomfortable. In 1898, at 17, Gladys made her debut in Paris society. Her father had been partially rehabilitated, enough wealth, enough time passed, enough strategic charitable donations to reopen important doors. He spent $40,000 on her debut season, wardrobe from Worth and Doucet totaling $18,000, jewelry purchases including a diamond and sapphire necklace valued at $12,000, a coming-out ball at the Hôtel de Crillon costing $8,000, and miscellaneous expenses, flowers, carriages, servants' bonuses, contributions to hostesses, another $2,000. Gladys was a sensation. Her beauty at 18 surpassed her childhood promise. 5 feet 6 inches tall, slender but curved, with that extraordinary face. The violet blue eyes, perfect nose, flawless skin, lips that sculptors would later call the most perfect ever created by nature. Photographs don't capture what contemporaries described. The painter Paul Helot said she was more beautiful than any woman I have ever painted, and I have painted them all. The sculptor Auguste Rodin said her profile was Greek perfection. The writer Marcel Proust, who met her at a salon in 1899, said she was beauty that makes conversation impossible. One can only stare. But she wasn't merely beautiful. She was formidable. She fluent in 4 languages, knowledgeable about art, architecture, literature, philosophy, witty without being cruel, charming without being empty. She could discuss Dante with Italian scholars and Wagner with German musicians. She intimidated men who were accustomed to decorative women who spoke only of fashion and gossip. Some men found this intoxicating, most found it threatening. The marriage proposals began immediately. Between 1898 and 1901, Gladys received at least 14 documented proposals from men of varying wealth and rank. There was the American railroad heir worth $30 million, who proposed after meeting her 3 times. The French aristocrat with an ancient title and no money, who proposed after seeing her at the opera. The Italian count with a Venetian palace, who proposed through an intermediary. At the English viscount worth £2 million, who proposed during a house party at Blenheim Palace. That last proposal is where our story truly begins. Because at Blenheim Palace, in the summer of 1901, 20-year-old Gladys Deacon met Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, and decided she would marry him. The fact that he was already married to Consuelo Vanderbilt, the richest heiress in America, was irrelevant. Gladys didn't accept impossibilities. She accepted challenges. The Duke was 24, cold, arrogant, beautiful in the way that English aristocrats can be beautiful. Perfect features, icy manners, complete assurance that he was superior to everyone in every way. He was also desperately unhappy. His marriage to Consuelo Vanderbilt had been arranged by his formidable mother, and Consuelo's equally formidable mother, Alva Vanderbilt. The marriage settlement was staggering. Consuelo brought a dowry of $2.5 million in railroad stock, plus a guaranteed annual income of $100,000 for life. The Duke brought a title and Blenheim Palace. It was a transaction, not a romance. They had produced 2 sons, John and Ivor, ensuring the succession. Now they lived separate lives within the same vast palace, bound by duty, destroyed by incompatibility. Gladys understood this within hours of arriving at Blenheim for a house party in August 1901. She watched the Duke and Duchess at dinner, seated at opposite ends of a table seating 40, never making eye contact, never speaking except through servants. She watched Consuelo retire alone at 10 o'clock. She watched the Duke remain in the smoking room until 2 in the morning. And she watched him watch her, Gladys, with an intensity that suggested possibility. She began her campaign immediately. Letters followed the house party, witty, intellectual letters that discussed art and architecture and philosophy, subjects the Duke cared about passionately, letters that never mentioned his marriage or his unhappiness, but made clear that Gladys understood both. Letters that arrived regularly, were answered regularly, and gradually became more intimate. By 1902, Gladys was visiting Blenheim Palace frequently. By 1903, she was considered part of the Duke's intimate circle. By 1904, she was his mistress. The affair was conducted with remarkable discretion, given the circumstances. They met at Blenheim when Consuelo was in London. They met at London hotels when Consuelo was at Blenheim. They travelled to France together. Gladys staying at her family's properties, the Duke staying at nearby hotels. They were never photographed together. Servants were bribed extensively. The Duke's valet received an annual bonus of £500 for his silence, equivalent to 10 years' normal wages. Gladys's lady's maid received £200 annually. Letters were destroyed immediately after reading. Dinner invitations were arranged so they appeared at the same houses but arrived separately. Consuelo knew. Everyone knew. But as long as the forms of propriety were maintained, society tolerated it. The Duke had produced heirs. Consuelo had done her duty. If they conducted separate romantic lives with discretion, that was their private business. Divorce, however, was unthinkable. The Duke would lose Consuelo's fortune. Consuelo would lose her title and social position. Both would be ostracized. Their children would be scandalized. So the marriage continued, empty but official, while Gladys waited. She waited 18 years. 18 years of being the Duke's mistress, while Consuelo remained the Duke's wife. 18 years of arriving at Blenheim as a guest, while Consuelo presided as hostess. 18 years of watching the Duke introduce Consuelo as "my Duchess," while introducing Gladys as "my dear friend." 18 years of Christmas cards signed by the Duke and Duchess together, while receiving private letters from the Duke alone. 18 years of patience that required iron will and absolute certainty that the Duke would eventually be hers. During these years, Gladys maintained her own establishment in Paris. Her father had died in 1901, and leaving his fortune divided among his children. Gladys's share was $1.5 million, placed in trust with 2 Boston lawyers as trustees. The trust gave her an annual income of $60,000, equivalent to approximately $2 million today. More than enough to live extremely well. Not enough to compete with duchesses or marry dukes. Her Paris apartment was at 16 Rue de la Pompe, leased for $4,000 per year. 8 rooms, beautifully furnished with 18th century French antiques, purchased at auction for $35,000 total. Staff of 4, Lady's maid, cook, housemaid, manservant. Total annual wage bill, $3,000. Her annual expenditure on clothing averaged $8,000, but jewelry purchases averaged $5,000 per year. She was building a collection, investing in pieces that would hold value. Travel expenses, entertaining, charitable contributions, and miscellaneous costs brought her total annual spending to approximately $55,000, leaving $5,000 annually for savings. She was comfortable, but not wealthy, by the standards of her circle. Women like Consuelo Vanderbilt spent $55,000 on a single ball gown. Gladys spent $55,000 on everything for an entire year. The difference was significant. It meant she couldn't compete financially. It meant she had to compete intellectually, sexually, emotionally. It meant she had to make the Duke need her in ways that money couldn't provide. She succeeded. By 1910, the Duke was completely obsessed with her. He wrote her daily when they were apart. He carved her initials into furniture at Blenheim Palace. He commissioned a portrait of her that he hung in the long library, where every visitor would see it. He asked her opinion on architectural projects, political positions, business decisions. He consulted her about his son's education. He told her things he told no one else. He needed her, but he wouldn't divorce Consuelo. Divorce required money, and money required Consuelo. His annual income from the Marlborough estates was approximately £40,000, equivalent to $5 million today. Substantial but insufficient for maintaining Blenheim Palace, which required at least £20,000 annually just for basic operations, staff wages, property maintenance, heating, taxes. Consuelo's Vanderbilt income provided the additional funds that kept Blenheim functioning. Without her money, the Duke couldn't afford his own palace. So he negotiated. In 1913, he proposed a formal separation to Consuelo. She would keep her title, keep her rooms at Blenheim, keep her social position. He would continue receiving her Vanderbilt income, but they would live completely separate lives, and he would be free to conduct relationships as he chose. Consuelo, who had her own lover by then, a French aristocrat named Jacques Balsan, agreed. The separation was announced quietly. No divorce, just separate lives under the same legal marriage. Gladys was 32 years old. She had been the Duke's mistress for 9 years. Now she could be his official companion, living with him at Blenheim Palace, functioning as Duchess in all but name. So most mistresses would have accepted this. Most mistresses would have been grateful for it. Gladys refused. She wanted the title. She wanted legal marriage. She wanted to be the Duchess of Marlborough, not the Duke's mistress installed in the Duchess's palace, while the actual Duchess existed elsewhere. She waited 8 more years. Those years were increasingly difficult. Her beauty was beginning to fade, not dramatically, but noticeably. At 35, the perfection of 20 was softening. At 38, lines appeared that cosmetics couldn't quite hide. She became obsessed with her appearance, consulting doctors about maintaining her looks. In 1917, on the advice of a fashionable but incompetent Paris cosmetic surgeon, she allowed paraffin wax to be injected under her skin, supposedly to smooth wrinkles and plump facial contours. The procedure was experimental, dangerous, and ultimately disastrous. The wax hardened, forming lumps that gradually migrated downward, distorting her face over subsequent decades. At the time, the immediate effect seemed positive. Her skin looked smoother, fuller, more youthful. She was pleased. She didn't know she had begun destroying her face. World War I complicated everything. The Duke served in military administration. Blenheim Palace became a military hospital. Gladys did volunteer nursing, wearing practical clothing and tending wounded soldiers. A strange interlude in a life dedicated to beauty and pleasure. Her father's fortune, still managed by Boston trustees, was damaged by war disruptions. Her annual income dropped from $60,000 to $45,000. Not poverty, but a reduction that required economy, So she closed her Paris apartment and lived alternately in London hotels and at Blenheim as the Duke's guest. Her position was awkward. She was the Duke's known companion but had no official status. Servants didn't know how to address her. Guests didn't know how to treat her. She existed in social limbo. Then, in 1920, Consuelo Vanderbilt finally agreed to divorce. She wanted to marry Jacques Balsan, who required his potential wife to be actually available for marriage. The Duke agreed immediately. He wanted to marry Gladys, and now he could. The divorce was finalized in November 1920 with a settlement that preserved Consuelo's annual income, gave her custody of their adult son's affections, if not their loyalty, and left the Duke free to remarry, but substantially poorer. Consuelo took half the Vanderbilt money back, and the Duke's income dropped from £65,000 annually to about £35,000. Still wealthy, no longer rich enough to maintain Blenheim without serious economy, Gladys Deacon and Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, were married on June 25, 1921, at the Chapel Royal, Paris. She was 40 years old. He was 44. They had been lovers for 17 years, waiting for 19 years since they met. The wedding was small, 50 guests, mostly close friends and family. Gladys wore a simple dress from Chanel, costing $800, and her own jewelry. No elaborate wedding, no massive reception. They couldn't afford it, and she didn't want to appear ostentatious. Her trust fund income, reduced by post-war economic problems, was now $35,000 annually. When his income was £35,000 annually, about $175,000. Combined, they had the equivalent of $7 million in today's money, enough to live extremely well, not enough to run Blenheim Palace properly. The marriage was doomed from the beginning, not because they didn't love each other, but because they had loved each other too long. They had loved each other through obstacles, through scandal, through separation. They had loved each other when love was impossible and therefore perfect. Now love was legal and therefore ordinary. Now they lived together every day, not in stolen weekends. Now they saw each other at breakfast, tired and irritable. Now they had to manage household accounts together, argue about money together, face aging together. The Duke discovered that Gladys, after years of independence, would not be a conventional duchess. She refused to manage the staff. She found household administration boring. She refused to entertain conventionally. Formal dinners bored her. She refused to be diplomatic with the local gentry. Country society bored her. She spent money impulsively on art, books, travel, things that interested her personally. She argued with the Duke about politics, about religion, about everything. She had opinions and expressed them. She was brilliant and exhausting. Gladys discovered that the Duke, after years of courtship behavior, reverted to being himself, cold, controlling, obsessed with rank and protocol. He criticized her endlessly. Her clothing wasn't appropriate. Her conversation wasn't suitable. Her household management was inadequate. Her expenditures were excessive. And her friends were unsuitable. She wasn't deferential enough. She wasn't grateful enough. She wasn't the duchess he had imagined. She was the woman he had actually married. By 1925, they barely spoke. By 1930, they occupied different wings of Blenheim Palace and communicated through servants. By 1933, the Duke was actively trying to force Gladys out, changing locks on rooms, cutting off her household allowance, forbidding her from using the staterooms. In 1933, he literally locked her out of Blenheim while she was in London, changing the locks and instructing staff not to admit her. She returned to find her possessions packed in the courtyard. She had no legal recourse. British law in the 1930s gave husbands enormous power. The Duke owned Blenheim Palace. The Duke controlled the household accounts. And the Duke could exclude her from the property if he claimed she was mentally unstable or disruptive to household management. Her title couldn't be removed. She was the Duchess of Marlborough legally until death, or his death. or remarriage. But her access to the palace and its income could be and was cut off. Her own money had been disappearing for years. Her trust fund, reduced by the Depression, now provided only $15,000 annually. She had been spending $40,000 annually maintaining her Duchess lifestyle. The deficit was covered by selling jewelry, selling furniture, selling anything valuable she owned. By 1933, she had sold approximately $100,000 worth of possessions to cover 5 years of deficit spending. Her jewelry collection, once valued at $60,000, was reduced to a few pieces worth perhaps $10,000. Her furniture, her art, her books, all gradually sold. The Duke provided nothing. Their marriage had no legal settlement requiring him to support her. 1920s divorce settlements had protected Consuelo. 1921 marriage arrangements had not protected Gladys. She had married for love, not money, and had negotiated nothing. She had assumed the Duke would provide for her. She had assumed wrong. From 1933 to 1940, Gladys lived in rented rooms in Oxford, supported by her dwindling trust fund. $15,000 per year, reduced by currency problems and economic depression to $12,000 by 1937. She rented a small house at 79 St Aldate's Street for £200 annually, about $1,000. Staff of one, an elderly housekeeper who worked for room, board, and earned £25 per year. Gladys's personal expenditure was reduced to bare necessities. Clothing was repaired rather than replaced. Jewelry sales continued. She sold her engagement ring in 1935 for £800. She sold her diamond earrings in 1937 for £600. Each sale provided temporary relief, followed by renewed desperation. Her appearance deteriorated dramatically. The paraffin wax injections from 1917 were migrating, creating grotesque lumps on her face. Her chin swelled. Her cheeks became distorted. Her beauty, the foundation of her power, was destroyed by her own vanity. She couldn't afford corrective surgery. She couldn't afford much of anything. She was 60 years old, living in 3 rooms, selling her last possessions, and still legally the Duchess of Marlborough. The Duke died in 1934, but his death changed nothing for Gladys. The title passed to his son by Consuelo. Blenheim Palace went to the heir. The Duke's personal estate, reduced by years of mismanagement and depression losses, was left to his sons. Gladys received nothing. The marriage had no provision for her, and the Duke ensured she was excluded from his will. His final revenge was leaving her with the title, but no means to support it. World War II made everything worse. Gladys's trust fund income, paid from Boston, was delayed and reduced by wartime currency restrictions. By 1942, she was receiving about $6,000 annually, worth perhaps $90,000 in today's money, but barely enough to survive. She moved from the house on St Aldate's Street to cheaper rooms, then to cheaper rooms again. By 1945, and she was living in a single room in a boarding house, paying £3 per week, eating minimal food, wearing clothes decades old. Her mental state was deteriorating. Neighbours reported strange behaviour, talking to herself, accusing them of theft, hoarding newspapers and rubbish. In 1953, at age 72, she was found wandering in Oxford, confused and unable to find her way home. She was admitted to psychiatric evaluation. The diagnosis was unclear: senile dementia, schizophrenia, the effects of malnutrition and isolation. She was committed to a mental hospital, initially temporarily, but she never left. For 24 years, Gladys Deacon, Duchess of Marlborough, lived in psychiatric institutions. First at Littlemore Hospital in Oxford, then at Cowley Road Hospital. And the trust fund continued paying $5,000 annually by the 1960s, $4,000 by the 1970s, barely covering her institutional care. She owned nothing. Her jewelry was long sold. Her furniture was long sold. The few possessions she had at commitment, some books, some photographs, a worn fur coat, were lost or discarded. Nurses described her as alternately lucid and confused. On good days, she spoke perfect French, discussed art intelligently, mentioned Blenheim Palace and the Duke as though they were current events. On bad days, she screamed about conspiracies, accused staff of stealing her jewels that didn't exist, claimed she was expecting guests who had been dead for decades. Her face, massively deformed by the migrated wax, frightened other patients. She wore layers of mismatched clothing, and she hoarded food in her room. She was, in the clinical language of the era, difficult and uncooperative. No one visited. Her American relatives were dead or uninterested. Her English social connections from her Duchess years didn't acknowledge her existence. Mental illness destroyed social connections more efficiently than poverty did. She was forgotten. On October 13th, 1977, Gladys Marie Deacon, Duchess of Marlborough, died in Cowley Road Hospital at age 96. Cause of death was recorded as cardiac failure and pneumonia. She had outlived everyone who knew her in her beauty and power. The hospital notified the trust administrators in Boston. The trust, nearly depleted, had approximately $8,000 remaining. Funeral costs were paid from this. Cremation at Oxford Crematorium cost £300, no service. And no flowers, no notice in the Times. The Duke's family, informed out of legal courtesy, did not respond. Her ashes were not buried at Blenheim Palace, where Dukes of Marlborough rest. They were not sent to America, where her family had originated. They were kept at the crematorium for the required period, then scattered in the municipal garden of remembrance, unmarked, unrecorded, indistinguishable from thousands of other forgotten dead. The final accounting of Gladys Deacon's fortune is brutal in its simplicity. She inherited approximately $1.5 million in 1901, equivalent to $50 million today. Between 1901 and 1977, that fortune generated approximately $3 million in income at various rates. Total available to her across 76 years, $4.5 million, nor approximately $140 million in current value. Where did it go? 18 years of maintaining herself as the Duke's mistress required elaborate establishments, constant travel, suitable clothing and jewels. Estimated cost, $1 million. The marriage years, trying to function as Duchess without sufficient resources while the Duke cut off access to his money. Estimated cost, $800,000. The 44 years after separation, gradually selling everything, living on declining trust income. Estimated cost, $1,700,000. Total expenditure, $3.5 million. The remaining $1 million was consumed by trustee fees, which over 76 years at standard rates would have taken approximately that amount. And she spent or lost an average of $50,000 per year for 76 years. She died with nothing. What did the money buy? It bought 18 years of waiting for a duke who wasn't worth waiting for. It bought 19 years of marriage to a man who hated her. It bought a title that meant nothing when she was locked in a mental hospital wearing someone else's discarded clothing. It bought 44 years of decline, poverty, madness, and abandonment. It bought a death so obscure that no newspaper recorded it. It bought ashes scattered in a public garden without a marker. What could the money have bought instead? If Gladys had married the American railroad heir who proposed in 1899, she would have been worth $50 million. If she had managed her trust conservatively and lived within its income, she would have had approximately $60,000 annually for life, enough to live beautifully, independently, securely. If she had married anyone other than the Duke of Marlborough, she would probably have died wealthy, comfortable, surrounded by family. Instead, she married obsession and died with nothing. The pattern is clear and terrible. Gladys Deacon spent her entire adult life pursuing a single goal, becoming the Duchess of Marlborough. She achieved that goal, and achieving it destroyed her completely. The 19 years of waiting destroyed her youth. The 19 years of marriage destroyed her fortune. The 40 years after destroyed her mind. Success was the catastrophe. But Gladys's story is not unusual among Gilded Age heiresses. It's typical. Shown these women inherited massive fortunes from fathers or grandfathers who built those fortunes through ruthless business practices, only to see their daughters lose everything through bad marriages, legal disadvantages, and social expectations that encouraged profligate spending. Alva Vanderbilt forced her daughter Consuelo into marriage with this same Duke of Marlborough, costing the Vanderbilt family millions and destroying Consuelo's chance at happiness. Barbara Hutton inherited $60 million and lost it all to multiple fortune-hunting husbands, dying nearly penniless. Doris Duke inherited $100 million and spent her life fighting fortune hunters, dying lonely and paranoid. The list continues: Marjorie Merriweather Post, Gloria Vanderbilt, countless others whose names are forgotten. The Gilded Age created unprecedented American wealth through monopolies, exploitation, and ruthless capitalism. It concentrated that wealth in robber baron families. Then it distributed that wealth to daughters under legal structures that gave them income but not control, title but not power, wealth but not wisdom. Those daughters were raised to be decorative, marriageable, and obedient. They were not raised to manage money. They were not taught to be suspicious of charm. They were not prepared for fortune hunters, predatory husbands, or the reality that their beauty would fade, but their vulnerability would remain. Gladys Deacon's tragedy is that she was too intelligent to be a conventional duchess, and not intelligent enough to avoid becoming one. She could discuss philosophy with scholars, but couldn't say that the Duke was using her. She could speak 4 languages, but couldn't understand that obsession is not love. She could appreciate art, but couldn't appreciate that her own life was becoming a cautionary tale. Today, if you visit Blenheim Palace, you can see traces of her. The portrait that the Duke commissioned still hangs in the long library, showing Gladys at 25, beautiful beyond measure. The room she occupied as Duchess is now a guest bedroom, redecorated to remove any trace of her presence. The palace library contains letters between the Duke and Gladys, sealed until 2025 by legal restriction, unread and probably boring. Decades of obsessive correspondence between 2 people who should never have married. In Oxford, 79 St Aldate Street still stands, converted to student housing. No plaque marks that a duchess lived there in poverty. And the boarding house where she spent her final independent years before commitment is torn down, replaced by a parking lot. Cowley Road Hospital, where she died, still operates as a psychiatric facility. The staff don't know that a Duchess of Marlborough died there. There's no reason they should. In the Municipal Garden of Remembrance, Gladys's ashes rest somewhere among thousands of others. No stone, no name, no indication that one of the most beautiful and most tragic women of the Gilded Age ended here, anonymous among the anonymous, forgotten among the forgotten. The woman who spent 60 years pursuing a duke, 19 years being a duchess, and 40 years losing everything rests in the most democratic grave imaginable, unmarked earth in a public garden. The title she fought so hard to obtain reads on official documents: Gladys Marie Spencer Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, 1881 to 1977. That title, which defined her identity and destroyed her life, survived her by exactly 0 seconds. It was extinguished at her death, passed to no one, meant nothing. The Duke remarried before divorcing her, making his second Duchess Consuelo again through legal complication. Then he died, and his son's wife became Duchess. The title moved on. Gladys was just an interruption. Her fortune's mathematics are simple and devastating. $1.5 million inherited. $3 million earned from that inheritance through investment returns over 76 years, $4.5 million total. $0 at death. 100% loss. 76 years to lose everything. That's $59,000 lost per year, every year, for 76 consecutive years. That's $162 per day, every day, from age 20 to age 96. That's the price of obsession measured in dollars and days. What could she have had instead? She could have married any of 14 wealthy men who proposed. She could have maintained her independence with $60,000 annually for life. She could have bought a beautiful house in Paris, maintained it comfortably, lived surrounded by art and books and intelligent friends. She could have traveled, studied, written. She could have been eccentric and brilliant and admired. She could have died at 96 in her own bed, in her own house, surrounded by beautiful things and people who loved her. Instead, she died in a psychiatric ward, wearing institutional clothing, her face destroyed, her mind damaged, her fortune spent, her title meaningless. The lesson is not complicated. Wealth without wisdom fails. Beauty without judgment fails. Obsession costs more than any fortune can pay. Gladys Deacon spent $140 million in today's money pursuing a goal that destroyed her. She achieved the goal. The goal was worthless. She realized this too late. In the end, what remains of Gladys Deacon? A portrait in a palace she can't visit. A name in Blenheim guest books from 1901 to 1933. Letters sealed in archives. A few photographs in museums. Some jewelry scattered to various buyers, her ownership forgotten. A grave that isn't a grave. Ashes in a garden where no one knows her name. And a lesson that every generation must learn again. That marrying a duke can cost you everything. That titles mean nothing. That obsession is expensive. That beauty fades. That fortunes vanish. That names are forgotten. She was born with everything. She died with nothing. The distance between those 2 points is measured not in miles or years, but in choices. Every choice she made, to wait for the Duke, to refuse other proposals, to marry him anyway, to stay when she should have left, to spend when she should have saved. Every choice led away from security toward catastrophe. She chose badly, repeatedly, irreversibly. The money paid for the choices. The choices destroyed her life. The life ended in madness and poverty and obscurity. This is the story of Gladys Deacon, the most beautiful woman of her generation, who became a duchess and lost everything, who pursued a man for 60 years and lost herself, who inherited a fortune and died in a mental hospital penniless. This is the story of how a woman born to wealth and privilege in the Gilded Age could end in a pauper's grave, how beauty and intelligence and fortune together could not save her from her own worst choices. This is the story, finally, of what wealth cannot buy: wisdom, judgment, self-knowledge, or a happy ending. The woman who was once proclaimed the most beautiful in Europe, who married a duke, who lived in Blenheim Palace, who inherited millions, rests today in an unmarked grave in Oxford, forgotten by history, destroyed by obsession, proof that every fortune, no matter how large, can be spent down to zero, that every life, no matter how privileged, can end in poverty, and that some prices are simply too high to pay, even if you have all the money in the world.